Please be seated. It is an honor to introduce Professor Stephen Crowell in his return to St. John's College. Professor Crowell is a Mullen Professor of Humanities Emeritus and Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Rice University. He is the author of two important books on phenomenology, Husserl, Heidegger, and the Space of Meaning with Northwestern University Press, Normativity and Phenomenology in Husserl and Heidegger with Cambridge University Press, as well as the editor of several volumes and the author of dozens of articles on classical German phenomenology. I find his scholarship to be exceptional among interpreters of Heidegger in that it avoids the pitfall of simply reproducing the idiosyncratic and specialized jargon of Heidegger's text and takes on the difficult task of translating Heidegger's terse prose into comprehensible English while preserving the philosophical nuance of his thinking. Tonight, he will be lecturing on Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology, which the seniors discussed and perhaps wrestled with last night in seminar. The title of his talk is The Challenge of Heidegger's Approach to Technology. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Crowell.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Brownie. I appreciate it very much, and I'm very pleased to be back at St. John's. It was several years ago that I first was introduced to St. John's and its beautiful campus, and at that time I was talking on Heidegger and art, and the conversations were extraordinary with students and faculty, and I look forward to more of that this evening as soon as I get my coat off. And this time I'll speak on technology, as you just heard, which is, according to Heidegger, a danger for which art might provide some saving power. Santa Fe and New Mexico generally provide the perfect context for this juxtaposition of themes, given the vibrant art scene here and the remarkable natural wonders, together with Los Alamos just up the road. So my remarks tonight will stick pretty closely to some difficult and controversial texts, the kind I'm told that St. John's students appreciate very much. But I will do my best to provide some ordinary language elucidations that are central to my own take on these texts. And you can call me out on my failures in that regard in the Q&A that follows. So let's get down to business. And perhaps you will forgive me, given the topic at hand, that I have not availed myself of any information technology in this talk. So it's just talk. Let me get a little. So the challenge of Heidegger's approach to technology. Of all the writings that Heidegger published after Being and Time, The Question Concerning Technology from 1950 is surely the most widely taught, and it's not hard to see why. Since 1950, our dependence on technical devices and the environmental consequences of technological manipulation of nature have only become more oppressive. And the essay provides an intuitively powerful expression of the uneasiness that we feel. Still, it's not easy to assess Heidegger's argument, nor understand his call to establish a free relation to technology. How are we to evaluate an argument that counsels us to abandon the philosophical tradition in favor of a measure for thinking that has been forgotten since the time of Parmenides? This is the challenge of Heidegger's approach to technology. I propose to address this challenge by highlighting two strands in the essay, a phenomenological strand, which defines what Heidegger considers the matter for thinking, and a temporal strand, which contextualizes phenomenology in what he calls the history of being, a story that holds that philosophy is responsible for nihilism. I will suggest that the phenomenological strand is independent of the temporal one and should be preserved, while the latter is, at best, a pedagogical device. My argument is presented in three sections: phenomenology, the danger, and thinking. And it will draw on the technology essay together with several others roughly contemporaneous with it. First, phenomenology. Heidegger's thinking from first to last follows the phenomenological path opened up by Edmund Husserl. And because Heidegger adopts phenomenology as the measure of his thinking, we too, if we think phenomenologically, should be able to make an independent judgment about which of his claims in the essay succeed by that measure and which do not. Phenomenology embraces the priority of seeing or intuition over argument. All soundness in argument ultimately rests on the intuitive presence, the givenness of the things themselves. Judgments alone are mere words, but they can be vindicated by the perception, or broadly, the experience, of what is judged. Where such intuitive givenness is unavailable, philosophers should suspend judgment. More specifically, phenomenology investigates the way that the givenness of things, their meaning and validity, is constituted in experience. The term constitution does not refer to empirical causality or composition, but to the essential structures of consciousness thanks to which ourselves included, can appear as they in truth are. Not a tree, but the tree as a tree. Phenomenological reflection is required here because these structures are not thematic in our everyday dealings with things. They are the inconspicuous conditions that make the meaningful appearing of things possible. In Being and Time from 1927, Heidegger emphasizes this point. Through concepts that let something be seen, phenomenological reflection makes us attentive to the inconspicuous, that which initially does not show itself, but belongs so essentially to what does show itself as to constitute its meaning and ground. Beings, entities, are what initially show themselves, but phenomenology makes the being of beings, their meaning, perspicuous. Being is not itself a being. It is the light or clearing, Lichtung, in which beings appear as something, such that we are able to understand those beings. Phenomenology makes this inconspicuous ontological difference between being and beings explicit, thereby preparing us for what Heidegger calls an Einblick, or insight, into that which is. Einblick, in Heidegger's language, is that glimpse of things granted by a chance flash of lightning which illuminates what is otherwise unapparent. Heidegger's example is the Parmenidean saying, esti gar enai, being is. Understood phenomenologically, this apparent tautology offers a glimpse of the difference between beings and being itself. Similarly, the technology essay is supposed to prepare us for a glimpse into what technology is, its being. In this way, the essay remains committed to the phenomenological priority of intuition over argument. Thinking must be guided by an experience of the inconspicuous if philosophical claims about it are to be verified, assessed according to the measure appropriate to them. But Heidegger also tethers this epistemic commitment to a historical thesis, which in Hegelian fashion spans the whole history of philosophy. In contrast to Hegel's story of rational progress, however, Heidegger traces how philosophy, as metaphysics, has led us to nihilism. Our reading of the technology essay, then, must attend to the historical thesis, the history of being, which frames it. The history of being begins with Plato and Aristotle, who conceived being logically as idea, or eidos. Heidegger calls their project metaphysics, which substitutes fealty to the concept, or the logos, for attention to the inconspicuous. Being is reduced to the isness of beings, Seienheit, determined as essence and existence. In this reduction, metaphysics conceals the experience from which it lives, the inconspicuous experience of being itself. Heidegger, in turn, seeks an other beginning that can recover from metaphysics' infatuation with reason by practicing tautological thinking, estigar enai. For Heidegger, technology represents the end stage of metaphysics in the history of being, namely nihilism. To stand against nihilism in a free relation to technology, it seems that Heidegger must close the books on the history of philosophy, cultivate an attitude of releasement, Gelassenheit, and await a glimpse of the inconspicuous without expecting what this glimpse will reveal. This should free us to experience a measure for thinking which, unlike the metaphysical concept, lets things be, neither for us nor in themselves, but for themselves, as Heidegger puts it. The historical thesis that metaphysics is nihilism lends pathos to the phenomenological account of thinking, but a tension between them emerges in Heidegger's discussion of the danger that technology represents. Focusing on this tension, as I will do here, suggests that the phenomenology of thinking is independent of its historical framing. So even if one is unconvinced by the claim that metaphysical philosophy is nihilistic, Heidegger's account of thinking as releasement, his riposte to technology's calculative thinking, can stand on its own. So that's the section on phenomenology. The next section, the longer one, is on the danger. The usual, as he begins the essay this way, the usual instrumental and anthropological definition holds that technology is a tool deployed by human beings. While this definition is correct, says Heidegger, it fails to reach the true. What is the true? And what is its relation to the essence of modern technology? If we approach these questions phenomenologically, not as questions about things, but about the meaning of things, then the instrumental anthropological definition fails to capture the meaning that prevails in modern technology. And that is what Heidegger calls the true, the hidden, quote, determining ground of the reality of all that is currently real. So, Heidegger asks, what do the signs of the times, our proliferating dependence on technical devices and the ubiquitous technological manipulation of nature and culture, tell us about our relation to beings as beings, the hidden meaning that inhabits our experience of all that is currently real? This question might give us pause. Is there a way that beings, simply as beings, concern us? If there is, we must distinguish between two dimensions of meaning or intelligibility in our engagement with things. A surface dimension, in which our everyday practices and discourses correctly reveal the properties of and relations among particular things, and a depth dimension, in which such things, properties, and relations are understood in terms of a single meaning, the true, that informs the whole. In the technology essay, this depth dimension is called the presencing of what is present, a meaning that prevails in everything that shows up as something. If we do experience such presencing in how things matter to us, it will be in an inconspicuous way that calls for phenomenological elucidation, and it will have a history. For instance, neither the medieval peasant nor the monk in the cloister had any special difficulty discerning the properties of things, plants, animals, and persons, icons, artifacts, and institutions. Their daily practices revealed things as what and how they are, enabling correct or correctable identification and judgment. But in medieval Europe, the presencing of all such things was understood or experienced as ens creatum, created being. This prevailing meaning prescribed an attitude toward the totality of beings that preserved a dignity for things in the face of human striving. In Genesis, Adam is granted lordship over all created things, but is also enjoined to tend and preserve those very things. Today we experience things otherwise. We too are capable of correctly recognizing differences among things and their properties. For instance, to use Heidegger's own examples against him, we do know the difference between the Rhine and a hydroelectric plant, or between mechanized agriculture and the fabrication of corpses in the extermination camps. But according to Heidegger, all such things presence in the same inconspicuous way, as shown in our behavior toward them. We no longer treat things as ens creatum, but as resources, standing reserve, or Bestand, Heidegger's term. How are we to understand such shifts in the depth dimension of intelligibility? For Heidegger, what we ordinarily call historical explanation will not do. For instance, it was not because medieval Europe was saturated with the biblical creation story that the medieval person experienced the whole of what is as ens creatum. Nor is it because mathematical natural science has eliminated values and secondary qualities from the real that we now experience beings as mere resources. Indeed, on Heidegger's account, technoscience is itself made possible by the inconspicuous experience of things as standing reserve. To approach the depth dimension of intelligibility, then, we need to understand how we can experience something as something at all. And this requires another detour through being and time. There we learn that something can show itself as it is only where it is also possible for it to show itself as it is not. And this requires a context in which what the thing is supposed to be is in play. One such context is provided by practices in which things are put to use. A hammer properly shows itself as a hammer when it is used to make something, and its properties show up as suitable or unsuitable in light of what is to be made, the work. But what determines what the work is supposed to be? If it is to be a birdhouse, then a small hammer and delicate nails are suitable. And if I use large nails and a sledgehammer, I've chosen the wrong tools for the job. Still, one cannot tell whether the resulting work is a failure simply by looking at it. It might equally be a fabulously successful artwork. We've seen these things, right? We need to know what the maker intended to make, and this in turn depends on what the maker was trying to be, a carpenter or an artist. Excuse me. This is why Heidegger claims that all meaning refers back to Dasein, his term for the human being, who acts for the sake of some possibility of its own. For instance, by trying to be a carpenter or an artist. And such trying is norm-governed. It can succeed or fail, both in its own terms and in fact. Strictly speaking, then, Heidegger says, only Dasein can be meaningful or meaningless, because Dasein is the being for whom what it means to be is always in question, the being who cares about whether it succeeds or fails at what it is trying to be. Care introduces a normative orientation into the experience of what is. And the resulting distinction between the meaning of things that show up in my practices and the meaning at issue in what I am trying to be prefigures the two dimensions of intelligibility posited in the technology essay. For example, we have names for things like students, teachers, lesson plans, chalkboards, grades, and graduations. These things are familiar to us. But those names signify only because the things so named can show up as succeeding or failing at being what they are supposed to be in the world of teaching. Showing up in the world of teaching does not exhaust what the things are, but it does reveal what they are. Their meaning for us is not projected onto them by us. Still, the world of teaching is disclosed only in my trying to be a teacher. Only because I allow myself to be bound by what I take to be best in the matter of teaching can I encounter certain things in the environment as relevant for teaching, and so succeeding or failing at what they are supposed to be. Trying to be something, for instance, a father, teacher, or friend, is what Heidegger calls understanding, the exercise of a skill or practical ability. On the Essence of Ground, he links such understanding to Plato's idea of the good, idiatu agathou, both because this indicates understanding's orientation toward what is best, and because such orientation looks beyond beings as a whole, epikeina tes ousias. This does not require that I know what is best in what I'm trying to be. Indeed, it entails a measure, the good, whose meaning is always at issue in my trying. When I acknowledge responsibility for the normative force of the measure, what teaching means as I understand it, I act authentically. But I act inauthentically, in contrast, when I evade that responsibility by deploying socially prevalent norms and values in a kind of technical way as recipes for being a father, friend, or teacher. How then does this basic structure of meaning constitution in being and time anticipate the two dimensions of intelligibility in the technology essay? We may think of the various worlds disclosed in my trying to be something, the world of fatherhood, teacher, musician, and citizen, and so on, as contexts of meaning in which the ordinary names for things enable us to make correct statements about them by becoming practiced in recognizing their properties and relations. What the technology essay adds to this picture is the idea that in addition to these various worlds, there is also a way in which beings, simply as beings, are experienced, a meaning that prevails through all such worlds. And if the phenomenological analysis in being and time is correct, this prevailing meaning must also be correlated with Dasein's trying to be something, because only Dasein's care for what it is trying to be provides the normative orientation required for meaning. Now, because a depth dimension of meaning prevails universally, it cannot be grounded in some particular thing I am trying to be. It must belong to every way in which I can try to be something. In the technology essay, Heidegger names this pervasive ability thinking, as did Descartes, if in a different way and for very different reasons. Heidegger understands Dasein as a thinking thing. Trying to be a thinker is the phenomenological correlate of the depth dimension of intelligibility. For instance, thinking grounds the difference between experiencing things as ens creatum and as standing reserve. As ens creatum, the thing's presencing is experienced as bestowed, perhaps by God according to a plan, and so as fixed. As mere resources, however, things and their properties are not experienced as bestowed, such that we ought to respect them in our behavior. They're merely our representations, which is another way of saying that things themselves do not matter. What matters, what counts as the reality of real things, is their fungibility. For example, the capacity, as Heidegger puts it, to be unlocked as sources of energy, to be stored up and distributed and switched about ever anew. Because the discernible features of things no longer tell us anything true about their being, Standing reserve, quote, no longer stands over and against us as object. No matter how things show up in our dealings with them as teachers, parents, or carpenters, their presencing has been drained of meaning, and we experience them as pieces of standing reserve, Bestandstücke. This loss of meaning, or the dilapidation, I love this word, Verwahrlosung, dilapidation of the thing as thing, is nihilism. Nihilism, the dilapidation of things as things, is a pathology of thinking that takes the form of calculation. Calculative thinking replaces things with functions, names with variables, in order to follow a path of its own construction. Where such thinking is entrenched, it is the function, not the thing, that counts. One thing is the same as another, and individually they count for nothing. Ordinary names remain, of course, and we're still fully capable of correctly discerning a thing's properties and its value. But this surface dimension reeks of the human all too human, and we behave toward things as though their being, estigar enai, had no claim on us. If the inconspicuous depth dimension of intelligibility today delivers an experience of things as standing reserve, Heidegger chalks this up to our failure as thinkers. To explain this failure, he offers the history of being, a story of epochal sendings or destinings, in which a general way of revealing is granted to all who dwell within a certain epoch. Calculation, quote, whether it uses numbers or not, is the ersatz thinking that prevails in our current way of revealing. Our critical question, then, is whether this story is supported by phenomenological evidence. A positive answer of sorts emerges from Heidegger's emphatic claim that being, quote, is in itself, from itself, for itself, the danger as such. Discussions of the danger of technology tend to center on obvious calamities: nuclear winter, global warming, devastation of the environment, genetically manipulated organisms going rogue, artificially intelligent machines conscripting us into servitude, or eliminating us as hindrances to an inscrutable design. There is certainly nothing trivial about such dangers, and the technology essay bears on them in important ways. However, Heidegger distinguishes such things from the danger as such, namely, quote, the destining which starts us on a way of revealing. Such danger does not lie in our use of technology, but in the essence of technology, which Heidegger calls enframing. Further, he argues that, quote, when destining reigns in the mode of enframing, it is the supreme danger. Why is destining of revealing danger as such? And why is enframing the supreme danger? Destining of revealing is Heidegger's temporal gloss on what he earlier called the true, the inauguration of a depth dimension of intelligibility which pervades our experience of things as a whole. The medieval epoch, in which an experience of things as ens creatum prevailed, is one example. Our own time, in which an experience of things, quote, in the mode of enframing prevails, is another. Our critical question thus becomes more specific. Is there a phenomenological warrant for the claim that such ways of revealing are somehow destined or sent? Well, some evidence is provided by the fact that if there is a depth dimension of intelligibility, then it is simply given. We cannot just decide to see things differently, to experience the world any way we like. As Heidegger puts it, quote, always the destining of revealing holds complete sway over us. The depth dimension is simply there, something in which we find ourselves. But this is not the whole story. Because revealing concerns meaning, what we find ourselves in is always at issue. Destiny, he says, is never a fate that compels. Rather, it prevails as a space of free play, or Spielraum, or freedom. The human being becomes truly free only insofar as it belongs to the realm of destiny, and so becomes one who listens and hears, not one who is simply constrained to obey. Quote. So if standing reserve is the way things present today, this is because the world itself is enframing. Quote, the world and enframing are the same. And of course, Heidegger always capitalizes the same. Now, enframing, the German term is Gestell, and it gathers various forms of positing, placing, and ordering, is not something that just happens like combustion on a distant star. Phenomenologically, we experience it as a kind of challenge, Herausforderung. A challenge is a dare or demand, something that cannot be what it is without an addressee, whose response is neither necessitated nor compelled. That is why any destining of revealing is danger as such. As addressed to freedom, enframing demands a thinking that can either rise to the challenge or fail to do so. What then does success or failure look like here? At the surface level of intelligibility, revealing is accomplished in our practices, the many ways we can try to be something, parent, teacher, friend. As we saw, the various measures at issue in such practices allow things to show up as succeeding or failing at what they are supposed to be in the worlds of teaching or parenting and so on. At the depth level of intelligibility, however, a single way of revealing pervades all these worlds. And so, as Heidegger puts it, we are continually in danger of pursuing and pushing forward nothing but what can be revealed through the destined measure, thereby deriving all our standards on this basis. For instance, he continues, where everything that presences exhibits itself in the light of cause and effect, the differences between tools, students, friends, and even God as causa sui and creator seem superficial. This sort of danger belongs to revealing, he says, in every one of its modes. And because thinking is involved in all the ways we can try to be something, thinking is our free response to the measure that a way of revealing puts into play. But attending to the measure, experiencing the world pervasively in its light, tends to conceal the fact that the measure is at issue in one's thinking, that what it calls for may not be appropriate to the matter at hand, that it is not the only possible measure. Being in time traces this sort of recognitional failure to our fallenness, our forgetful absorption in the familiar. Later, Heidegger redescribes fallenness as thinking's errancy, our ability to, as he puts it, stray from our essence. We stray from our essence when what is addressed to us in a destining of revealing is taken simply the way things are, rather than as a challenge, an address to freedom that calls for thoughtful response. Thus, to say that a destining of revealing is danger as such means that it tends to present itself as the only way of revealing, thereby concealing our response ability. The risky business of trying to think what is at stake in what is thus revealed. Failure to recognize our responsibility is errancy, but errancy is not necessitated, and so the possibility remains that we can experience our essence as our needed belonging to revealing. Danger as such, then, lies in our being responsible for meaning. Here, the second part of Heidegger's claim becomes salient, namely that enframing is not just danger, but the supreme danger. What makes it so? Enframing reveals things as standing reserve. One of those things is the human being. It is not that we don't recognize differences between human beings, machines, and lifeless nature or whatever. Rather, it is that we act as though such differences finally do not matter. This entangles us in a contradictory self-understanding. On the one hand, calculative thinking, our commitment to the norm that only what we can mathematize is real, positions us as Heidegger puts it, lords of the earth. On the other hand, calculative thinking conceals the responsive essence of thinking, thereby denying us our only resource for responding to the challenge of enframing. As he puts it, when we do not apprehend enframing as a claim, we fail to see ourselves as the ones spoken to, and hence also fail to hear in what respect we exist in the realm of exhortation and address. This means that we ourselves, the lords of the earth, will have to become taken, as he puts it, as standing reserve, human resources. Hence, enframing is not just any danger, but the supreme danger. So far, we've interpreted destining of revealing phenomenologically as a way of talking about how we experience the meaning of things. As a challenge or claim, destining calls for thinking, our response to the measure at issue in the claim. Any way of revealing is danger because it conceals itself as a way of revealing, presenting itself simply as the way things are. Enframing is the supreme danger because it conceals itself in a particularly insidious way. By substituting calculation for thinking's orientation toward what is best, enframing conceals the responsive essence of thinking. We thereby experience ourselves as standing reserve, caught up in the nihilistic dilapidation of things. The technology essay responds to this double bind of nihilism by invoking a line from Holderlin's poetry. Quote, "Where the danger is, there too the saving power grows." This recalls Heidegger's claim that a destining of revealing is not a fate that compels. And in a moment, we will examine his ideas about what kind of thinking is able to address the challenge of technology by hearkening to the saving power. But let us first have done with the question of whether the phenomenological account of the depth dimension of intelligibility requires a history of being, according to which ways of revealing are sent by being in distinct epochal stages. On that story, metaphysics names the history of how thinking's responsiveness to being's epochal sendings has been covered over and forgotten. To achieve a free relation to technology, it seems, we must gather the whole of Western thought, including the phenomenology practiced in being and time, into a single chapter. Only so can we attune ourselves to the saving power that is said to grow together with the danger. Only by thinking the closure of metaphysics as nihilism, it seems, can we get sufficient distance from calculative thinking to hearken to another measure. How are we to assess this story? On the one hand, it looks suspiciously like a speculative construction in which being names a sender which withholds and grants itself. But this has the inconvenient consequence of treating being as a being. On the other hand, the supposed epochs of being do not unfold with dialectical necessity. They address freedom, which retains its essence throughout. Heidegger's story, then, might be understood as a pedagogical strategy for attuning our freedom to the dilapidation of things while reminding us that nihilism is not an ironclad fate. On this interpretation, the history of being is not a deep truth about historical development, but a strategy aimed at encouraging our thoughtful praxis, not an historical thesis, but hortatory discourse, urging us to exercise our freedom. Indeed, Heidegger himself once characterized his writings on the history of philosophy as historial ponderings, not historical accounts of what is past. Ponderings which bring, quote, the futuro in what has been into the light of day as a task for us. Since this interpretation does not require that we posit an agent which sends historical epochs, we are free to assess Heidegger's phenomenological approach to technology without reference to his history of being. Nevertheless, we still need to understand how thinking, as addressee of the challenge, can establish a free relation to technology. And some hints can be found in Heidegger's reflections on Gelassenheit, or releasement, a term borrowed from the 13th century German mystic Meister Eckhart. So, final section, thinking. Heidegger discusses releasement in a fictional conversation between a researcher, a scholar, and a guide, Weiso. By conversing with representatives of science and philology, intellectual practices that stand in close proximity to thinking, but in fact conceal its essence, the guide hopes to identify, quote, the origin of the essence of thinking. If thinking is the essence of the human being, then calculative thinking is, quote, the rational animal, well, this is not exactly a quote, this is my fanciful way of translating. The rational animal's suicide, or Vernichtung, because it annihilates meaning, the element in which thinking lives. But as the supreme danger, it is also the soil in which the saving power grows, the possible rebirth of the thinking being through hearing and responding differently to the danger that addresses it. Heidegger describes that response, the origin of thinking, as, quote, indwelling releasement to the worlding of world. So we should look briefly at each of the three main terms, starting with worlding. This unusual word signals Heidegger's worry that the phenomenology of being and time failed to capture something essential about the concept of world. The problem seems to be that because being and time conceives worlds, for instance, the world of teaching, as grounded in human projects, its analysis remains stuck in subjectivism and representational thinking and cannot recognize the worlding of the world itself. But I want to push back a bit on Heidegger's implicit reduction of phenomenology to modern representationalism. In explaining why representational thinking is so fatal to things, Heidegger refers to Leibniz and Kant, for whom the thing's presencing becomes a function of the subject's synthetic mental activity. But as Heidegger surely knows, being in time does not reduce things to what faces us, to our perspective on them, and their look from such a perspective. Nor is the phenomenological concept of world a synthesis of such looks. Instead, it is the meaningful horizon of Dasein's practices. And as horizon, it is defined topographically in terms of regions of proximity and distance, presence and absence. It is what surrounds us, outside our field of vision, behind our heads, as it were. But maybe Heidegger's real reason for thinking that the phenomenological concept of horizon is unsuitable for grasping the world's worlding is just that the horizon is centered on us. This gets to the heart of the matter. To conceive the world as horizon, it seems, is to define it in terms of our projects. That is, not merely in terms of our visual perspective, but in terms of will, Wille, defined by Leibniz as striving perception that aims at a goal. To will the end is to will the means, we might say. And because being in time opens with an analysis of instrumentality, or techne, it might seem to belong to this Leibnizian tradition. However, instrumentality itself is grounded in Dasein's trying to be something. That is, in praxis, which, unlike techne, does not represent that for which it strives. Trying to be a father, teacher, or friend is not willing in the Leibnizian sense of envisioning an outcome to be brought about through my striving. Rather, it is committing myself to acting in accord with what it means to be a good father, teacher, or friend, a meaning that remains an open question and so provides no recipe for making oneself one. In trying to be a father, caring about being one, I think it better to act in one way rather than another. But such thinking does not specify the means for achieving a temporally distant end. Instead, the metaphor of a path suggests itself. Following a path has a sense of direction, Sinnrichtung, and so is not a ramble, but neither is it measured by a goal. In trying to be a father, my thinking follows a path. I feel my way along, exercise judgment guided by a sense of direction. If we can accept the path metaphor, the question becomes, can Heidegger's characterization of the origin of thinking as indwelling releasement to the worlding of world really dispense with the phenomenology of care centered on our trying to be something? On the one hand, Heidegger acknowledges that being needs the human being, thereby preserving the phenomenological correlation between meaning and the human being. The worlding of world requires the thinking being. On the other hand, it is not clear that indwelling releasement to the worlding of world retains the key phenomenological aspect of trying to be something. Let us turn then to the second key word, releasement. Does it involve my trying to be a thinker, acting for the sake of being one? At first, Heidegger appears to suggest that it does not. After considering why science is inadequate as a model for thinking, the researcher and the scholar are perplexed by about what their guide really wants from the conversation. Forced to answer directly, the guide says, quote, "What I really want," the word is will here, was ich will, "from our reflection on thinking is not willing, nicht wollen." All three are aware of the paradox here. Isn't thinking something we do? And so a kind of willing. The paradox is resolved by distinguishing between two kinds of not willing. The first, quote, "a refusal of willing," should lead us to the second, releasement as the sought-after essence of thinking, which is altogether nothing like willing. The guide's formulation thus proves to be a strategy for looking away from thinking in the sense of something we do, so as to admit us in the right way into not willing, the proper attitude for thinking. But if this distinction dissolves the paradox, it still leaves us with a problem, for it seems that if the experience of thinking is preceded by a refusal of willing, i.e. refusing to try to be a thinker, it cannot be slotted into the earlier phenomenological account. Indeed, Heidegger's term for thinking that is not a willing, namely releasement, seems to reinforce that point. A closer look, however, suggests that releasement still acts for the sake of being something in the phenomenological sense. Heidegger introduces this point by distinguishing between waiting and expecting. Warten and willing modeled on willing, which is modeled on techne, expects a definite end, represented as what is to be brought about through the willing. In contrast, releasement is a, quote, refusal of willing. It does not represent to itself what is expected from thinking. It is a waiting that expects nothing. You can think here of kind of Taoist tropes, Wu Wei, and so on, which Heidegger is thinking about. It does not represent to itself what is expected from thinking. It is a waiting that expects nothing. Nevertheless, it is not a mindless waiting. It is mindful, the German term here is Besinnung. It is mindful of itself as taking its direction from the anticipation of a thinking that is not a willing. But why isn't that an expectation, an outcome defined as that state in which we no longer represent things? It is true that the conversation circles around a specific problem, namely identifying an alternative to calculated thinking and its annihilation of the human being's essence. However, that problem is not a technical one where the goal is set, expected, and only the means are at issue. Instead, the conversation takes place on a country path, Feldweg, where one must wait for what shows itself along the way. What one waits for is not expected, but it is anticipated according to the path's sense of direction. Hence, thinking is praxis, a trying, quote, a trying that does not expand into a stance or fixed way to be, but, quote, gathers itself into and remains in the composure of releasement. In this way, quote, thinking that is not a willing has the phenomenological structure of Dasein's acting for the sake of being something, namely a thinker, in which what it means to be a thinker remains in question every step along the path. When I try to be a father, I'm guided not by an end to be achieved, but by a meaning that is at issue at every moment. As I carry out fatherly tasks, I can be said to wait for the meaning of those tasks, and so of fatherhood to show itself. But that showing is not something that happens in the future, and so it is not expected as a definite outcome. It belongs to the challenge of trying to be as such, always. Along such a path, I can do things that bring about ends that I've represented in advance. For example, preparing a menu for my daughter's wedding. And I do them for the sake of being a good father. That is, for my daughter's sake. But these are not representations of what it takes to be a good father. They're not prescribed by the meaning of fatherhood in the way that technical means are prescribed by the end to be achieved. The meaning of fatherhood remains at issue no matter what I do. I await it in releasement, the attitude that belongs to the mindfulness of trying to be, or the thinking that belongs to trying to be. We come finally to the third element in Heidegger's definition of thinking's origin, namely indwellingness or Inständigkeit. And here the guide makes direct reference to the phenomenology of being and time. In Being and Time, resolute Dasein is understood as one who, in her commitment to being a mother, for example, recognizes her responsibility for the normative force of what addresses her as the meaning of motherhood. Indwellingness is a kind of resoluteness in this sense, a way of dwelling within the address as its addressee. The term thus reflects the kind of immanent normative guidance that characterizes going along a path, the sense of a direction that pertains to trying to be something. The address to which I respond is and remains inconspicuous, at issue, never becoming an explicit rule. Applying this analysis to the present case, then, means that the essence of thinking, quote, would be resoluteness toward the essencing of truth, and indwellingness would be, quote, the genuine essence of the spontaneity of thinking. This, finally, is why being, the worlding of the world, needs the human being. There is no address, no sending or destining without an addressee. When thinking is annihilated by calculation and being an addressee is dilapidated into a lord of the earth who is also a human resource, there is no being, no worlding of world, and the universe goes silent. Heidegger's claim that thinking originates in releasement, then, does not require us to reject the phenomenological analysis found in Being and Time. We need only apply them to our particular now, the time of need in which we find ourselves, as the technology essay itself does. It's just an application of those concepts. Nor must we understand that time as destined or sent by being, the ineluctable outcome of a first errant beginning. Such a story might be helpful pedagogy, but it remains an appeal to freedom, to decision in the face of danger, where what it means to be a thinker, being at home in our essence, is at issue. As Heidegger puts it elsewhere, a free relation to technology requires that we finally learn to think. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.